You're listening to the Psychedelic Invest Podcast, where we speak with founders, CEOs, investors, advisors, experts, and thought leaders in the brave new world of psychedelics and entheogenic medicines. Brought to you by Psychedelic Invest, bringing you unparalleled psychedelic investing data and analysis. Psychedelic Invest is the industry's leading resource for those looking to invest in the burgeoning psychedelic industry. For more information and to access all of the podcast episodes, check out our website at psychedelicinvest.com/podcast. And now, here's the host of the Psychedelic Invest Podcast, Bruce Eckfeldt.
Welcome, everyone. This is the Psychedelic Invest Podcast. I'm Bruce Eckfeldt. I'm your host.
And our guest today is Cody Shandraw. He is partner and director at Ambria Capital. We're going to talk to him about what they're seeing in the psychedelic space. We're going to talk a little bit about how it's similar and different than cannabis. And we're going to kind of see like what companies are out there, what's interesting from an investment point of view, and really kind of where this market is going. I'm excited for the conversation. I think this is kind of understanding where psychedelics are and where we are as an industry is a little bit of a moving target here. But, I think we're learning more and things are shaping up. So I'm kind of excited to kind of really kind of understand from someone's in the space, doing work with companies, placing money, helping them grow. It's going to be an interesting conversation. So with that, Cody, welcome to the program.
Bruce, thank you for having me. Super excited.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. So before we kind of dive into what's going on in psychedelics, let's kind of understand your background, personally, professionally. Like, how do you get into this? Tell us the story.
So I guess high level, psychedelics was something that was actually introduced to us at one of the cannabis conferences. Didn't even know that it was an option for us to invest in back in 2019. We were at the Benzinga conference down in Miami, and one of the bankers actually came up to us and asked, have you heard of this company called MindMed? And that's how it all started. It was amazing, obviously, being involved in the cannabis space and seeing all of the different verticals that were being invested in at the time and being a part of something that's obviously had such a large cultural part of the American fabric. And what goes back even maybe a little bit farther and more impactful than that is psychedelics. There was a tremendous amount of work obviously done in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and even the early 70s before everything was shut down. Yeah. So while several of us have had personal experience with psychedelics. A lot of family members and friends, everybody knows, everybody's heard something. And even if they haven't used them, kind of what you've heard through the grapevine about them, just made it a really exciting and interesting space to take a look at. And then, unlike the traditional pharma model, we already had decades of data and reports showing that, there was unbelievable success in treating so many different things, related to mental health. A lot of people don't even know this, but Alcoholics Anonymous, for example, one of their founders originally planned on using LSD as part of their treatment of getting people, off of their alcohol.
Helping people with addiction,
Yeah, so, it was just something very exciting. And as obviously the network started to grow and all of these companies started popping up, one of the really unique things about the space is where cannabis originally was kind of centrally located, all of the companies in the US and Canada, this is completely different. It's completely global. We have companies all over the world, in the UK, Ireland, Canada, the US, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, literally everywhere, Israel. So it's a much more global industry than cannabis was when cannabis was in its infancy, kind of moving.
And why do you think that is? Like, is it just because of the nature of how the markets were structured or the regulations were structured? Or what's your insight on why this is a much more global play?
I think probably because 1 in 5 people in the world experience some form of mental health issue. Yeah. I think that cannabis was more looked at, obviously, when it started making its push into mainstream, it tried to almost disguise itself as medicinal, but we all know, just in the United States alone, there were 60 million built-in users of cannabis here. It was just a completely different thing on the recreational side where I don't know if it's really I don't want to say COVID helps, but let's be honest. It's tremendously stunted social contact, interrupted activities that, normally lower stress levels. I just think that the timing was ripe for something like this to really, from a cultural aspect, kind of help ease the burdens that have been placed on us over the last 19, 20 months here. So, and then obviously, listen, the scientific community, again, gets back to these being studied for decades.
Yeah, so I'm curious, tell me more about how the fact that we do have a fairly significant body of research and knowledge and, trials and, of using, using psychedelics versus cannabis. I think, obviously one of the challenges we've had is we don't have this data, right? We haven't been able to actually do studies and clinical trials and things like that. So there's a kind of a dearth of real understanding of how things work and effectiveness and, modes of operation and stuff. I mean, how has this helped psychedelics to actually have this body of work in terms of the actual driving the industry at this point?
I think it's created an aura of legitimacy around it that cannabis didn't really have. Obviously, when Sandoz kind of was able to, Albert Hoffman at Sandoz was able to really synthesize it in 1938, it was originally as a stimulant for respiratory and circulatory ailments. I mean, at the time when they were really trying to discover exactly what LSD did, Sandoz was giving away unbelievable amounts. I mean, literally hundreds of liters of this stuff to people all over the world for them to formulate their own trials and practices. And, unfortunately, there was such a great amount of work done, like I said, in the 40s to 50s, and then towards the 60s, unfortunately, I hate to kind of put this all on one guy, but really, I mean, Timothy Leary kind of made, just made the industry to a point where it was stigmatized again. And, unfortunately, those are lasting effects even today. I mean, I've talked to several researchers and doctors from all over the world. I mean, especially in the U.S. where, it was stigmatized so bad, where they don't even like talking about the work that they're doing because of, the government crackdown that was on it. Now, obviously, the DEA has been great in granting exemptions and licenses for a lot of these labs, colleges, universities to, begin work. And obviously, Canada has just been, I wish I could say enough positive things about them. The Canadian government has just shown such a willingness for clinicians.
Why do you think the governments, regulatory DEA and the regulators and the governments and stuff have been seemingly much more open and willing to allow this to develop than the cannabis market?
If I had to guess, obviously I'm not privy to those conversations, but
your best guess, educated guess.
Yeah, I think because they now see, where some of the mistakes in the 60s that were made, where you had, therapists and doctors and all of these people saying, listen, man, just take some LSD at home and use it recreationally, where before it was handled in such a safe manner, and it was really inclusive to so many different walks of life, alcoholics, drug addicts, even just mothers that were dealing with stress at home. But the conversation started to shift drastically towards recreational use, especially of LSD at that time, where I think that's why the government really clamped down on it. But now, again, because you have such a large regulatory framework, whether it's the National Institute of Health or the FDA or Health Canada, now that all of the templates are being followed for safety, to make sure that obviously not only they can be marketed in a safe manner, but they're also being used in a safe manner. There's a real large push, and I'm very happy to say that we've been investing in clinics all over the world that are now really being leaders in the space and not only developing methods of use, but also the safest protocols to use these in controlled manners. While I think the recreational side for a lot of people is how they were introduced to psychedelics, I think that we're going to see the most advantageous steps forward in the clinical settings. And because there is such a large infrastructure now of doctors and therapists that are willing to use these products, whether it's MAPS or something like that are training all these therapists all over the world, I think that they see that the regulatory aspect is coming back to the industry. So they're more open to not only allowing the study of them, but also the use in humans.
Yeah. I'm curious what you're investing in. I mean, what are the companies out there right now? What are they doing? Why invest in them? What are you looking for in terms of opportunity? Give us a sense of really what's happening in the market, or how you see the market as an investor, and what's interesting for you.
So one of the things that makes us very unique is we manage all of our own money. We don't have any outside shareholders or investors, so it's really cut the red tape of what we can invest in and how we can invest. So our portfolio is, I believe personally, the most diverse of anybody in the space right now. We have invested in several companies all over the world, like I was saying, that are putting up clinics for everything: psilocybin, ketamine, LSD, MDMA, literally everything you could possibly think of under the sun were legal in those jurisdictions. And then obviously the drug development side, companies that are creating analogs of existing compounds or creating completely new entities themselves, new chemical entities themselves. The space is so ripe for opportunity because these things were kind of locked in a box for decades, that now all of the research that was done, like we were talking about, so many decades ago, you have a brand new group of scientists that have been able to look at a lot of these existing compounds and their, let's just say, better properties and some that are less desirable. Not shockingly, some people don't want to go sit in a therapist chair for 6 to 8 hours and trip really hard. So, you see companies that are developing chemicals that have quicker onsets and shorter half-lives, or, even some companies that are taking the trip completely out of the experience, but are still getting the desired results that the trips had.
Yeah, kind of a tripless high.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then, there's some really interesting things happening on the technology side. We've invested in 2 really incredible companies they're creating new chemical entities, but they're inside of AI learning. So instead of having to follow the traditional, quote unquote model of drug discovery, now they can take one drug and spin off thousands of different analogs and new chemical entities based on that existing drug to see which drugs are going to be the most safe. And also, getting rid of some of those tendencies that, certain therapists, physicians, and even insurance companies don't really want to be a part of. So, the opportunity has just been, every time I think I've seen it all, there's something new that's knocking on our door every day.
I'm curious, how do you think this market is going to develop? I mean, is this going to become, like, other kind of drug therapy kind of markets, things that have been kind of developed and brought to market? Or how do you think this is going to be similar or different than some of the other things that have happened, kind of drugs that have been developed?
Yeah, I have this conversation so frequently now. I find myself shifting back and forth depending on who I'm talking to. I hate to use the analogy, but I guess it depends on who's in the room, right? Whether it's the suits or whether it's the roots.
Yeah.
Listen, we all know that the usual methods of, let's just use anxiety or depression, or even addiction, whatever the case may be. It looks like the ceiling for SSRIs or talk therapies, or, in the cases of addiction, 12-step programs or rehab programs, the effectiveness for these things are just so small.
Yeah.
It's just a large percentage of the sufferers they're not being taken care of. One of the reasons why we've kind of invested so heavily into the space is all of us have loved ones that have been affected, whether it's from addiction or depression. And, we've seen that the traditional model just doesn't work. I think that probably the most important thing to look at here is there going to be mainstream adoption for a lot of these different therapies and new chemical entities or existing ones. And I think that you already, whether it's Johnson & Johnson with S-ketamine and Spravato, it seems like the adoption is there. People are ready to try something new. So I think just like any blossoming industry, listen, when you're making this many frontier investments, you're going to have some mistakes that look foolish in hindsight, right? As the industry matures. But at the same time, the asymmetric rewards when the analysis plays out it makes that worthwhile. And I think that pharma is going to look at that as the exact same type of model that a lot of the VCs right now in the space are looking at it. So is there going to be mass consolidation like there was in cannabis? Of course.
Every industry.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that the pharma model of them developing drugs in-house, listen, it's so expensive and time-consuming, and you would need an army of people to do this. Why would you not have a bunch of small companies go out and do all the legwork? And then, listen, as soon as it shows some promise in phase 2 or phase 3, then they can come in and acquire and use those deep pockets to kind of take it to the next level. So,
yeah.
I mean, I think that the industry, of course, as it matures, there's going to be mass amounts of consolidation. And, you know, just like any industry, I think that there's going to be a lot of people that are jumping on for less than noble pursuits. It's just, unfortunately, it's the nature of the business, right?
Where do you think we are in timing? I mean, like a lot of this is a lot of it. What I've been trying to figure out is, you know, where are we in the cycle and how long is the cycle going to take, right? So, you know, we're in this kind of early stage, lots of new ideas, lots of, you know, early stage companies that are coming to market. And then, yes, there's going to be a consolidation phase. There's going to be a maturing phase, right? Like, where do you think we are in that kind of process? And then, you know, is this a 10-year process, 5-year process, 3-year process? I mean, based on what you've seen, what are your guesses on how this is going to play out?
Really tough to say. You know, we obviously have this conversation internally almost daily. Sure.
I hope you do. If you're not, you should be.
Yeah, I really think, you know, we're probably at stage 2 or 3 right now. There was obviously so much interest in late 2019, early 2020, and then towards the fall, you really seen a large market depression. You know, a lot of the public companies, a lot of the private companies, the valuation just came really crashing down. And then, I don't know, maybe around the, let's say, late fall, early winter in 2020, everything started blowing back up. And then in January of this year, I mean, everything just exploded again. I mean, there were over a dozen IPOs and RTOs that were taking place, and, you know, the media exposure just went absolutely crazy. We had a little bit of outside analysis done just on the, you know, the media footprint and what was kind of culturally relevant. And it's funny, in 2020, there were less than 50 major publications that covered the topic. Mm-hmm. And already in this year, and, you know, what are we, a little over halfway through, there's already been over 500. So I really think that the industry it's so early still. And I mean, unfortunately, listen, the hype is real now. We've seen the valuations just skyrocket as of recently. I mean, there were companies that had intellectual property portfolios that were absolutely incredible at valuations that most people in the pharma and drug discovery world could never dream of seeing.
Yeah, so talk to us about that. Like, what are some of these valuations? What is it based on? You know, how are people justifying this? And then, like, why does it fit or not fit some of the other markets that are similar to this?
The valuations have been one of the most interesting parts of this industry, I would say, since we've been involved. You know, we've made 43 deals in the space, and I can tell you the valuations from 2 years ago to a year ago to today are completely different. Companies that had multiple different molecules in their pipeline through phase 1 and phase 2 trials, you know, the valuations were just so low because, listen, obviously, number one, you're dealing with scheduled substances that have been kind of blacklisted from the mainstream for so long. So a lot of people were very cautious, and it was also very hard for a lot of these founders to raise money at the time. You know, where now it seems like because there is such mainstream adoption in the media, in the finance world, in the investment banking side, you know, I mean, I can't even tell you how many investment banks I've seen over the last 6 months enter the space where, you know, last year at this time, I mean, there were maybe 4 or 5. You know, there's over 20 now. So,
so you think it's just the demand for placing money has just driven up the valuations?
Yeah, it's 100%. Unfortunately, you know, it's a catch-22 because now these companies obviously have much higher valuations. They're raising much larger rounds, but a lot of these early-stage companies are failing to even build on their ideas, you know, without proper resources.
It's like what happened in cannabis. It's like, you know, the evaluation was just through the roof, but then that puts pressure on the companies, and they just can't meet those expectations. They just can't deliver on that return.
Yeah, it's exactly it. And then, again, getting back to maybe the actors that are running operations that they're maybe not qualified to, I don't think a lot of these people really understand the amount of money and time it takes to get a drug through the clinical process.
Yeah.
Let alone passing the standards that are, maybe the most stringent in the world of the FDA, just on the pharmaceutical side. But a lot of these guys, I guess just because you are raising money at a certain price, maybe it doesn't mean you should have. Stretching the valuation, it's going to punish anyone who's operating outside of the hype cycle.
Yeah.
I talked to several founders now where they're having investors ask them why the valuation is so low on their companies, because they've seen companies that have less of half of what they have inside of their pipeline, but are raising at valuations that are 10 times higher. So it's really, I guess, and listen, we obviously know this from any industry in the world. While past successes never guarantees future performance, I think it's a very strong indicator of where a company is headed. And I think that some of these founders lack not only the management expertise and the back office functionality, but just the general understanding of the compliance and regulatory bodies that they're going to be navigating through over the next several years.
Yeah. Where are you finding these founders coming from? Where have you noticed kind of the source of, starting these companies and founders? Are they coming from certain industries, certain situations? What's the theme that you've seen from the founder side on the psychedelic space?
So 2 years ago, I would say more than 75% were from the cannabis space, man. You've seen a lot of guys that made their names and, made a tremendous amount of money, kind of moved over because they seen the next wave. And listen, that's just like anything, right? There were mining guys that moved into crypto, and then crypto guys that moved into cannabis. Yes, it's just the next wave. Yeah, man. It's and listen, that's a good thing too, right? It's the entrepreneurial spirit, kind of seeing what's next in the pipe. And our fund has been very successful because we've invested in a lot of those emerging industries. So it's a great thing. But now, I would say more than 75% of the founders, especially over the last 12 months, almost every single one of these guys have pharma experience.
Yeah.
And, it shows not only on the clinical side of their operations, but also on the drug development side. Their understanding of the processes and the amount of capital that is required to get something through is just, it's...
Yeah, what are they? I may have heard various kind of numbers, but what's your sense of to really take a drug through, a chemical through, the clinical trial process? Like, what are the phases and what generally are kind of rules of thumb of how much you need for each phase to really make this work?
So, listen, it depends obviously of what's in play, whether it's a new chemical entity or whether it's something that, is just starting. Yeah. I really think to be conservative, you should be expecting 5 years.
Yeah.
I really... Listen,
and that's just to get through the approval process.
Exactly. We're not even talking about commercialization at that point, of getting them into doctors' hands and getting them into therapists. The beautiful thing that obviously a lot of these companies are working on are, like, let's just use psilocybin for an example, is, listen, at this point, it's just going to be finding target indications. Mm-hmm. I think the approval process is probably going to be much quicker than for these companies that are developing new chemical entities. And listen, obviously the main question that regulators face is, number one, do you keep the patient safe from dangerous drugs, which I'm not saying these drugs are dangerous, but this is how they're looking at it. Yeah. But also taking the necessary risks to advance medicine, right? It's one of the things, obviously, that when taking experimental drugs, there could be devastating side effects. Let's be honest, and especially for... let's just use addiction, for example. You're talking about a very, very high-risk patient pool.
Yeah.
Here.
Powerful situation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And, whether it's, AIDS in the 90s or cancer, listen, some of those experimental, unproven treatments, they could end in death. In some cases.
Yeah. Yeah, understanding how to use them, side effects, all this stuff is so unknown that there's a non-trivial chance of negative consequences with some of these research.
But I guess the beautiful thing is, listen, is you now have I mean, hundreds of thousands, I mean, really millions of patients, but let's just say hundreds of thousands that have opened just into something like depression. We know SSRIs, like we were talking about earlier, listen, it's just so moderately effective. I mean, they know that something new has to be tried. So as long as the proper protocols are in place for experimenting, with unorthodox new treatment methods, I think everybody's open to. I mean, you're talking hundreds of billions of dollars in expenses for insurance companies right now dealing with these things that have no treatments available currently. I mean, they have to try something new.
Yeah. It can't get much worse.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, or can't really go backwards at this point. So it just is what it is.
And in terms of the money that these companies need to raise, I mean, to get through 5 years through, all the stages of clinical trials, what do they have to raise? Like, what is it? Like, what's the number, just ballpark number of what it takes to get a drug approved so you can even just begin to go to market?
I guess, again, it gets back to who you're talking to. I mean, some of these guys, man, you talk to them and they're like, listen, I'm just going to raise $10 million and it's going to get me through phase 2s. And I mean, it makes your head spin sometimes. I mean, I would have to guess, and again, it depends on who you talk to. I would say $100 million is probably at the low end in a lot of these cases.
Yeah.
I mean, you talk to some of the legacy pharma guys, and I mean, you're talking $2 to $3 billion through commercialization. Exactly. I mean, I don't, you see some of these press releases for companies that are talking about raising, $50, $100 million, and oh my God, this takes us to, it's a drop in the bucket to really what you need. And listen, obviously, a lot of these things are being granted, special designations in certain therapies. So, while there may be a lot of one-offs or where the FDA will accept smaller or shorter trials, I think a lot of these things, like I said, are going to be multi-year, multi-$100 million processes, conservatively.
Yeah. And what are the other kind of bottlenecks in the industry right now? Like what's kind of holding things back from things accelerating, or what do you anticipate things being kind of hiccups or restrictions, challenges, limits in the industry as things scale?
I'd say two things mainly. Number one, making sure that the science that is being preached is being practiced. I think that there has to be such stringent testing and protocols right now. I mean, God forbid, I hate to use this guy's name again, but another Timothy Leary moment in the industry, I think, is the last thing that everybody needs. We're at such a pivotal point right now where it seems like the opportunity is right. Again, and it's back to the COVID thing. There needs to be additional opportunities for people that want to try new therapies, even if it's cancer patients for end-of-life treatment, to help ease their suffering or pain or fears, whatever the case may be. So I just hope that nobody steps outside of the bounds of what is medically accepted and proven. I mean, while it's great to let people try certain things, beating your drum and telling everybody that they need to do or try, I guess, differing opinions on administrations or treatments, it gets a little scary. So I just hope that everything's followed along for what not only the regulators, but also the clinicians that are studying and proving out a lot of these things are telling their patients of how to use them. And then number two, I think there's going to be a giant bottleneck of qualified and trained therapists administering a lot of these things. One of the real special, we've personally and as a fund made several donations to MAPS. You need nonprofits in the space that are going to be pushing the boundaries forward and also going to be doing a lot of the training for therapists and clinicians. You could have all the drugs in the world, but guess what? If we don't have the proper protocols to administer them or also help alleviate any fears that may, come into place after taking them, then I mean, really, this is all for nothing.
Yeah.
So it's one of the reasons why we have made such a large push into the clinic space. There has to be places to do these drugs safely.
Yeah. I think it's a big, interesting kind of difference with cannabis. Cannabis is a little bit more of like, we just got to get product onto the shelves and people can use it. They can do it themselves. We don't need a whole lot of infrastructure to bring this to market or actually have users, customers use it. Where in this case, this is just part of a whole system that needs to be in place with facilities and therapists and technology to actually create the solution, right? It's not just the chemical, right? It's the therapeutic process that needs to get designed. So I think it's very interesting to kind of see this play out from what needs to get developed in the industry. And I think, beyond the drugs, there's all these other things that need to happen.
Yeah. And I think, that's kind of get back to the first thing you and I talked about, kind of what separates cannabis from psychedelics is the recreational versus the medical side. I think almost everybody involved inside of the psychedelic industry right now understands the therapeutic approach for almost every single one of these compounds.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. Cody, this has been a pleasure. If people want to find out more about you, about the work that you do, what's the best way to get that information?
Always feel free to reach out to me, Cody@AmbriaCap.com. Can find me on social, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, @Shandraw Cody. And also want to take the opportunity just to say, listen, find the companies like MAPS, like Beckley, the people that are doing the right things in the space, and give them a follow. You'll always see the tip of the spear of what's going on from the regulatory backing of just the industry overall.
That's great. Cody, I'll make sure that all those, the links and the handles and everything are in the show notes here so people can get that. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Of course, Bruce. I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm looking forward to seeing the rest of the group of presenters on here. I know several of them are very excited that have recorded and are going to be recording in the future, so I'm really looking forward to it.
I say excellent. Yeah, no, it's been it's a fun industry. It's been a fun conversation, and I'm excited to get this content out there.
All right, Bruce, I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Psychedelic Invest Podcast. If you liked this episode, please be sure to leave a 5-star rating and leave us a review. You can find more episodes on all the major podcasting platforms and our website at psychedelicinvest.com/podcast.